So, welcome, I guess. In this video, I kind of want to make just a really quick, not too long video about just engines in general, specifically looking at a used engine, what you kind of want to look for, say if you're going to buy a used engine from someone or an engine depot or something like that. Just some small things that you want to kind of do and some tools that you might need to do that. So let's get going. Let's get started. I'm going to try to stay behind the camera as much as I can because I know this isn't very pretty to look at, so come here. Alright, so first things first, what do we have here? This is a Honda B20B, I think is what the Honda people call it. This one is now in my possession, but it came in with a failed leakage test, which I will be showing you. This engine was running really rough. It got pulled out of the car, and it came to me, and I figured out that cylinder 2 was leaking in the valves. I will show you how I did that here in a second. This here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this very well on the cylinder head, but let me see if it'll focus. See these rings right here? This is where the valve sits here. This one's kind of been cleaned up here, but this was the problem cylinder. It looked a little bit like this one here. I don't know if my camera's focusing, but you can see those little black spots. They're kind of like pitting and carbon buildup. But what was happening was this carbon buildup here was holding the valve open a little bit, and it wasn't letting the combustion chamber seal correctly. So it was causing a misfire in cylinder 2. I will show you how I got to that, which is why I have the big motor out. I wish I made a video on this when it was all assembled and as soon as I got it in, but you know, I didn't really think about it, and also my girlfriend wouldn't let me use her camera. Shout out to Bay. So let me show you what I did. This here is a Toyota 7M GE engine that I got for free, and I will be tearing this down and looking into it more a lot. My plan is to stick this in a shell and throw it into a wall as fast as I can. But I'm going to show you my process with diagnosing this B20 head on this 7M. And like I said before, this video is also if you're going to buy a used engine from someone or an engine depot. This is something that you could do with the engine out of the car to just give it a pretty quick rundown to get an idea of how good the engine is. So let me show you how to do that. The very first thing you want to do with any engine as soon as you get to it is just a visual inspection. Look at the oil pan, see if there's any dents or anything. Maybe the oil pan was hit, and there's a tube in here that picks up the oil that sits like a 1/4 inch from the bottom of the pan. If the pan's bent and that tube is bad, and the engine happened to starve of oil, it's gonna need a full teardown. So that's just something to look at when you're buying a used engine. Check out the oil pan, make sure it's all good. Do a quick one-over of the side of the block. See if you see any cracks or, you know, breaks or anything like that. I recommend always replacing accessories like water pumps and stuff like that and seals while you're in there. But, you know, it really depends on how much you're willing to spend and on you. Look at the valve covers as well, just to see. These are the Toyota valve covers here. Again, you're looking for any types of cracks or anything like that, any obvious signs of defects. Now, depending on what you have with you, you may be able to take the valve covers off and look at the cylinder head. As you can see, this one is very, very, very clean. So in general, it was pretty well taken care of. That tells me that oil was changed on time, stuff like that. However, I think that this cylinder head has been done before just because the entire head is really clean as opposed to looking something like this. I'm curious as whether this thing, the head was chemical cleaned and stuff. That's why it looks so good. But in general, if you see a engine with really clean cams and really clean stuff underneath, typically speaking, if it's if it hasn't been sent to a machine shop, or if it's not a race engine or anything like that, it's more likely than not just been well taken care of. So the next thing you want to look at after that is your coolant chambers. Let me see if I can get a good spot here. Yeah, you can kind of see in there a little bit, but what I'm not trying to see is this. What I don't want to see is, let me get out of the shadow here. I'm not sure if you can see that, but there's kind of an orangish color right here. That tells me that there's a lot of calcium and rust buildup inside of the cylinder, inside of the coolant jacket. And that just means that they were probably just running straight water in there. The engine could have overheated at some point. Just something to be careful of. And that's something you could do just by looking through your radiator hoses, checking the rust. You don't have to take the cylinder head off like this. It's just easier to show you what I'm talking about. So the next thing that you want to look at, of course, all of the outside stuff could be good, but what about the internals? Does it hold compression? Obviously, this thing doesn't have a flex plate or flywheel on it, so there's no way of hooking up a starter to a housing or anything. So the next best thing to do, I didn't even get my tool out, is get you one of these. Sorry that I'm just walking around with the camera right now. I don't have a tripod yet. I'm looking to get one, so unfortunately this video is going to be kind of shaky. I apologize, but this is just kind of a test run video, my first video, just to see how things go. Anyway, back to the tool. You can get these from Harbor Freight, and it'll give you, it's going to give you a roundabout idea. But as far as diagnostic tools and torque wrenches go, I recommend going big or going home. I don't care about the hand tools. I'll use Harbor Freight wrenches and stuff like that. But diagnostic tools, you want to make sure you're getting the most accurate, the best possible reading you can get. Also, you want to make sure that you're buying the best possible drinks you can. This stuff is absolutely dope. I'm not sponsored by Coke. I just absolutely love this stuff. So yeah, anyway, this is a cylinder leakage tester, and there's two kinds. This one here, which I prefer because it just has the percentages around on this one. The other version, it just has two pressure gauges, and you've got to do a little bit of math with how much the outgoing pressure is compared to the incoming pressure, and that tells you your percentage leakage. So I'm going to take off the camera, get this hooked up, and talk a little bit more about this tool and a little bit more about what you're doing and what you're looking for when you're looking at a used engine. Alright, and so I've got my hose hooked up here. I've got my air tank filled up. Now, you don't necessarily need an air compressor. If you can get just a portable air tank and fill it up with 100 psi, that'll be more than enough. But anyway, I got my compressor filled. I got my hose hooked up to the spark plug hole here, cylinder number 1. And I have the valve cover off. You don't need them off if you have the intake and exhaust off. But I have it off just to show you kind of what you're looking for. So starting out, I'm starting on cylinder 1. I have, I don't know if you could see that, this line here matched up with this mark on both sides. That means I'm top dead center cylinder 1 on this engine. Check your service manual or your manufacturer instructions to tell you what cylinder 1 is. You don't, for the leak down test, you don't have to be on top dead center because you're going to be rotating the engine anyway. The important thing is that both valves are in the completely closed position. And that's going to change every cylinder you rotate this. It's going to change these marks. It's just a good reference point. So what you do right now, I might have to put the camera back down. Anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook the end of my gauge up to my leakage tester here, and what I do is this is a collar here that pulls up and pushes down. I'm going to pull it down to unlock it and twist it until my gauge reading reads 0%. I'm going to try to catch that on video, but this is going to be kind of difficult, so let me see what I can do. Alright, so, kind of doing this odd, but anyway, I'm hooking up my air gauge, and as you can see, the high side is at 100%, or the high side, the percent side is at 100%. So I'm just going to take my regulator valve and start twisting it until I get to 0%. And that is zeroing out your gauge. So now I'm ready to hook this springy boy up to the cylinder and see what my leakage is. So 1 second here. Pick you back up. Okay. So, like I said, I've got my hose hooked up to cylinder 1. Cylinder 1 is on top dead center, which means both valves are open. If you have your valve cover off, you can verify that by your cams pointing up on the intake and exhaust side. And I know, what is this? I think this exhaust here. I know this guy here doesn't exactly look like it's down, but I do promise it is closed all the way. You can also, which I don't have my light with me right now. If you have a light, you can look into your intake and exhaust ports and look at your valves. I apologize for not having a light, but you can see if they're seated or if you can see a little gap into the cylinders. But anyway, what you want to do now is very difficultly plug up your gauge here, and as you can see, I've shot all the way up to 100%, which means my cylinder isn't holding any pressure. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm going to take my wrench, my ratchet here, and you're supposed to rotate from the crank, but I got this motor for free. It didn't come with a crank pulley or crank bolt, so I'm gonna rotate it from the cam. It's not recommended to rotate it from the cam, but like I said, this was a free motor, so I kind of don't care all too much. So I'm ready to rotate the engine. What I'm going to do now is just kind of listen where the noise is coming from. If you have the valve covers on, you can take the oil cap off and listen to if the air is coming from the crankcase. That tells you that it's leaking past the air is leaking past the rings. And it's not. I can actually hear air coming out of the exhaust port, which means that this, I lied to you guys, and this exhaust cam is open a little bit. So I'm going to rotate the engine until that's no longer the case, and then I'm going to check and see where my leakage is at. So here's what I do. I just kind of, I could probably back the engine up. You're not supposed to back the engine up, but I'm going to back the engine up. Okay, sorry about that. I had somebody pull up. But back on this thing, I rotated it so both valves are open again. If you take your valve cover off and look at your cams, actually on a little bit closer inspection, if you could see these flat parts right here, that's where a wrench goes, and you can rotate the cam like that. So that's what I'm doing with this guy here. But anyway, back to this guy here. I have my gauge set up to 0%. plugging in, and very hard to do this, but if I rotate my engine, I never got it under 60% leakage, which means that something is keeping the combustion chamber from holding pressure. Listening around, I can actually hear it coming in right through the cams here, which tell me that if the air's coming into the crankcase, that means it's blowing by the rings. So more likely than not, the rings on this guy are bad, and it's going to need a full teardown. The other option to that is the option that I had with that Honda engine there. The valves were hanging open, so no matter how much I turned the cams, and even if the cams were pointing straight up, I still had leakage because the little piece of carbon was holding the valve open just a little bit. If that were the case, you would hear air coming through your ports, which, like I said, for this specific example, I don't. I hear it coming in through the oil chamber. So this one is going to need a tear down at some point. I will be doing that in the not so distant future, whatever. But just to show you, that's what I'm looking for. Now, that's realistically all I want to show you. The other thing you can do with this that I have used this leakage tester for is I had a cylinder misfire on a Dodge Ram, and the ignition system completely checked out. Compression was good. All of that was good. Fuel injectors, all of that were good. But it still had a misfire. Now, that engine is an overhead valve engine, which means it uses lifters and push rods and whatnot. But anyway, the issue was I hooked my leakage tester up. I set the cylinder to closed. It was cylinder 3 on the truck, but I set the cylinder to closed, which means the cams were pointing up and both valves were closed. And I rotated the engine a full stroke cycle, and what I'm pretty much doing is making sure that airflow is good, which a compression test will not tell you. A compression test will tell you if the chamber is sealed, but it will not tell you if the chamber is flowing. The leakage test will, which is what I prefer over the compression test, though it is a little bit more time consuming to do. So as you can see, my cylinder's closed. If you can listen to the engine while I turn this over, if I can turn this over with one hand. Here, I'm going to set my camera up actually. If you can listen to the engine while I'm turning it over, you're going to hear the air get a lot louder. And what I'm looking for is when the cam opens the intake side, for the air to come all the way out of the intake. And with the cam turned down on the exhaust side, for air to come out of the exhaust. And it's going to sound something like this, just like that. Now that is the exhaust side opening, but that's what you're going to hear, and you're going to be able to take your finger and just kind of push it in the hole, and you hear that sound change. I'm blocking the port off with my finger, and I can feel the air flowing out of it. So that means the exhaust valve is opening and closing for the most part. Like I said, there's a leakage problem on this engine. I'm not really convinced where it's coming from, but I'm going to tear it down later. But this here tells me that air is coming, at least the valve is opening some. You repeat the same process for... So you repeat the same process for the intake as well as every cylinder in the line, and that will tell you if A, your chamber is sealing with the valves on top dead center. An acceptable leakage is less than 20%. If you have more than 20% leakage, then that means that air is escaping excessively from somewhere and you need to find it. Ooh, camera went dark. Sorry, I'm kind of fighting the backlight of the sun into the garage. Now, like I said, don't stop there. If you get your less than 20% leakage, you also want to rotate and check that you're losing that leakage when the valve opens, and you want to check that the airflow is coming out. How I diagnosed the Dodge Ram was I passed the compression test, I passed the cylinder leakage leak down test, but as I was rotating the engine, I noticed that there was no air coming out of the exhaust side of the engine, which told me that if you think about the overhead valve engine, something was wrong in the lifter system that was preventing the cam from the valve from opening. I ended up tearing the engine down. What happened was the roller stopped being a roller on the cam and ate straight into the cam. The lobe was completely grounded off. So it ended up needing a cam, rollers, and, you know, typical head job for an overhead valve engine. But you don't really have to worry about that too much on overhead cam engines because they don't use lifters like that traditionally. There are engines that overhead cam engines that use hydraulic, they're called zero lash adjusters, but this is not one of them. For an engine like this, you don't have to worry about it. And wow, yeah, I don't know if you can see underneath the cam lobe there's like a silver disc shaped thing under the lobe. This is it here. Nope, wrong drawer. It's something like this, and sunlight again. As the cam pushes down, that little silver dot right there pushes down on the valve, and that's what opens the valve on this engine. Adjusting these really suck, but it is what it is. So yeah, repeat the process on all of the cylinders. Rotate the engine on each cylinder to make sure that the valves are actually opening and they're not binding up or anything like that. I would hate for you put a cylinder head back together. Something is binding. Go to crank it, and Jesus Christ, what is that, yo? Look at this. Ah, it's a fucking dragon. Thing is fucking huge. I would hate for you to have a head all put back together, and for something to be binding up if you don't check it, and then you have to take it all back apart. Not fun at all inside of a car. Not fun at all. So that's about really what you look for. Once you pass the leakage test, it pretty much tells you, say you have less than 20% leakage and you have made sure all valves are opening, that pretty much tells you your combustion chamber and your valves, your valve train and rotating system are working correctly. The only other check that would be really important to do, and this one is not very easy to do, would be to see if the bearings on the bottom end are good. And how you can do that is by taking off the oil pan. And is this one here loose? Nope, I've got all... No, I don't. Let me show you.